This session is meant to be a feedback session of the work and the great conversations you've been having in the small group session that we have before lunch. So my job is just sort of to facilitate a bit of a talk back, so your group has an opportunity to share with everyone some of the important or salient points that were discussed.
Working on it was really reinforced the need for women to organise. The mindfulness, the body control was a very important element in being able to push back in an individual circumstance where the structural intimidation is really at play. And obviously giving women a louder voice in the forums where the union is visible, in the uni-wide community meetings, and ensuring that professional staff voice is heard as well. And the other points were in the roadmap were to bring women together, obviously in a around issues that are relevant, recognising how time poor people are, addressing the factionalism that is obviously very visible in all our workplaces and the unions and all those forums. The visibility of the union, that it's an organisation, but the people are the union, not a branch secretary, not an organiser, but the actual members are collectively the union. Using some of the strategies around that were scripted questions for council meetings where there was an absence of leadership. Also watching out for that absence of leadership in any situation and learning how to address it, be that through approaching another uni's branch committee if you don't have an effective one where you are. So not being afraid to use the union-wide sort of expertise to address your situation. One of the points was there an academic and professional member collaboration at each site that the union's present at. And Jessie pointed out that a really good model that they had to bring academic and professionals together was a weekly course meeting, but it really broke down the divide between professional and academic members. And I think one of the points we recognise is that we're very good at standing up for other people and not so good at standing up for ourselves. So the activism and the theory and controlling your body reactions, everybody felt that was a really valuable thing that we should probably work into our roadmap. So that's it. Thanks.
One of the things we started talking about was the barriers to both involvement in unions and in leadership. And we were taken back to the thought of the Greedy Institute, and that's still one of the barriers for many women, is that more involvement in things outside of our workspaces on top of the work we're doing after work as well. So we're working, then we're coming home looking after young people, old people, men, whoever. Can we fit this in on top as well? So that's one of the barriers that we need to acknowledge, that gives women often less space to do this than men. We also acknowledge there's a barrier that as women we'll also often, once you start doing something, you get asked to do more and more and more, and that's both at work, at home, in the unions. That idea led to some discussion around whether or not we should have some assertiveness training, to assist women to say no. I don't need that personally, but I think it's an idea. If this is an issue, that we need to say no in other areas so we can actually put towards this area. Another barrier we talked about was that possibly it's perceived as a deterrent to career progression. Now, we don't know if this is so or not. Some people think that, if you get too involved, then you might not progress your career in the uni. But we're not sure if that's the case. So I think either, research or something to find out whether that's the case or not. Because if it's not the case, then that's part of our marketing strategy, is that it will have no effect on your career.
Or might have positive.
Or might have positive effect, which is what we talked about as well. And that was an issue for sessional staff too. So that sessional staff feel that their involvement in the union is not the way to go to get more work. So, it begs a bit of research, I think. Some people, so as the positives some people felt that it was useful to their career to be involved in the union because they got to know lots of people, and so people would look at them as the person who knew everybody and who had connections. So it is possible that it is seen as a positive thing. And whether that depends on the school you're in, whether you're academic, professional, who knows. One of the things we talked about was needing to tackle perceptions about unions and unionism, activism. One of the things I guess that I've noticed, and the group certainly felt the same way, was that with younger people, if you start talking about feminism or unionism, they think this is something that happened in the 70s and it's all over and finished now. And it's only those older people who still, go on about it. So we need to sort of look at that because younger people are seeing union activism in that way. So how do we attract more younger women in particular and get across that it's not old, we still need it, it's not finished. So which took us to marketing. We talked quite a bit about how do we market this? So one, we're marketing to get more young women, but then we're also looking at marketing to get the women who are involved, the women here, for example, now taking leadership positions. So you're already in, but now we want women to move up. So that then comes to, how do we market that? It's about power, it's about social change, it's about social justice. Changing the perception of women in authority. So this is one of a couple of interesting things I think we came up with, and we didn't necessarily all agree. And that might have been either generational or personal, about whether some people feel that as women they don't feel comfortable having a position of authority. Do we need to address that? And I guess, conversely, how do men feel about women in authority? So someone was talking about, how over all these years there's been only one woman president here and one woman secretary here and one, so why is that? That led us into an interesting discussion about men in the union's position around this. That it's not good enough to just say, yeah, we support women to be in the union and we support women to go into leadership. We want the men in the unions to be more active than just saying, yeah, we support you. Whether that might even mean we get to the point where men stand down from leadership positions and support women to take up the positions. A radical idea. So I think there are larger discussions. How do you feel, Ron? So I think there are larger discussions to be had here about that it's not just about women within the union fighting to get these positions. It's about all of us in the union, men and women, fighting to get more equality happening and having a leadership that's more representative of its members. And the last point was Sally McManus. Can we get Sally McManus to champion and lead the change? Can we get her a lot more involved in, championing our movement, I guess? And that's it.
We did do slightly differently from the other two groups, that we were interested in structures and understanding of structures. So we had Juliet write this on the board for us when we started out to show us from the bottom-up level up to the top of national leadership, and then showing us where various opportunities for women to get involved are in, and explaining that to us, which is good. We were also talking about the importance of the processes and the networks, and now I'll go into some details about that. For the question about the roadmap and getting women involved, we talked about the fact that some of the people in our group got involved in the elected branch committee level by being tapped on the shoulder to do so. And we were talking about those processes, about how that happens because they were union members, and then having that opportunity through that happening. and then telling the story about when they got on the committee, how effective they felt, that there was a lack of knowledge at the beginning of how to be effective, and they're questioning themselves about that, and then explaining over time that getting involved in subcommittees where there were actual activities and specific things as part of the actions, that made them feel useful. So I guess there's this question about learning and involvement and prior knowledge before you get into some leadership roles. We talked about this dynamics of being tapped on the shoulder, and that might be particularly male ways of doing things, which has been happening for a long time. And there's some questions about that on the democratic nature of that process for selecting people to get involved. But on the other side, also asking, should women be doing those things? Should we be following that method of identifying leadership people and tapping them on the shoulder and supporting them and thinking about getting involved and making sure they've got the information that we need? And then in talking again about some of the difficulties, there was a accounting of previous experiences prior to joining the university and other workplaces, saying some suspicion of unions because of bad interactions in previous workplaces. So in thinking larger about getting the wider membership of our universities involved in the union, we might need to do some education about unions and their values. Not everybody's on the same sheet of music. I confess I come from the American South, and unions are a bit alien to me in how they operate. So we've got people coming from all over the world with different cultures and knowledges. So we might want to take account of that. The book Lean In was recommended as a source of information. And then finally, on that question one, we did reflect upon what Mary Margaret was talking to us and saying, when we think about gender rights in the union and activating women's leadership in the universities, we might also think about the intersectionalities with other human rights issues and social justice issues to look at how we can support each other. So widening our support base and widening our impact is going to be also involved with looking at other groups of people who are suffering injustices and rights issues. Some of the particular obstacles we recounted from our own experiences are this issue of networking, that it seems to be that you can succeed as a woman in our context and in the union if you're networked. We all recognize that networking is very important. But what our group talked about is not everybody is good at networking and what we might do about that. You know, we have people who are introverted. We have people who are isolated because of particular experiences or issues. So we might also think about that not everybody's able to tap that equally in the space that they're in. Talked about the difference between groups who need solidarity and how do we create ways to have conversations across our differences. And this is again referring back to Mary Margaret and this intersectionality that we perhaps need to have more impact. We were critical of men's clubs and the impact that they have, but when we get women going for leadership roles, we find that women get criticized really strongly and on points that men wouldn't be criticized on. In my mind, that brings up Julia Gillard and what happened to her, which we all, paid attention to. But we have it here in our own leadership, and this question, how do we make sure that women run for leadership actually get judged or supported on the criteria and not on things that are extraneous and that men wouldn't have? So we may want to address that because it becomes a barrier to getting women active. And then this question about when women are tapped on the shoulder for leadership positions or to be involved in committees for decision making, it's often in niche areas, and women can be placed in the role of gender advocacy when they're tapped on the shoulder to serve on committees. But at the same time, there's another issue to that. It's good to get women involved, but it's also women get taxed in that representation as well. So we need to think about how we do these things. On the question 3 about ways forward, we recognized as union members that the key seems to be, from the theme of our discussions, the importance for the union to work on education, training, and support. We need better training of our members to inform them, better access to training, more information for members. They need to understand the union better. And then we might need specific training. This has already been said in assertiveness. Like my previous speaker before me, I actually don't have that problem. In fact, I might need to be taught the second thing of conflict resolution. Some training along these lines, though, so that when we assert our place and our power and our authority, that we're able to do so effectively and with some support. In knowing that information, I've just put in parentheses little golden information about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership at the national level and the role of Celeste Little for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members of our union. So there's a strong system of support. How widely do people know about these things, or the Women's Action Committee? So those things need to be part of that. We need networking, and we perhaps need special interest groups in NTEU. Is that something that we can work on? We need women in leadership of branches, and that's what this effort's about. So we're looking forward to seeing how this comes about. And then lastly, a question, do we need an affirmative action policy on the part of the NTEU? Should the union consider some idea like quotas? And we debated that. There were differences of views of whether that might be a good idea or not. So those were some of the things we considered.
My group started off with a really interesting discussion of how are we actually representing the problem of women's voices not being heard within the union or within the university sector more broadly. And we had a little think about, is that simply a lack of women in leadership, or is it more so lack of the representation of women in our sector? And I mean, I think they're inextricably linked in a lot of ways, but how we go about addressing that problem, how we go about addressing a problem, we have to really think about how that problem's being framed, and are we solving the right problem? But again, being that they're often quite linked, I think that while we need to have wider representation of all women in our sector, in the union, that women in leadership positions will be a way of making that happen. So we spent the rest of the time identifying, sort of like Group 2 did, a lot of the sort of barriers and enablers of women's participation in the union movement and in leadership positions. Some of the key barriers that we discussed, which are really similar to some of the barriers other groups brought up, was that there's this view, whether it's real or perceived, that participation in a union, especially if you're a casual academic or casually employed on a contract with your academic staff or professional staff, is a negative, or that it will impact your career negatively. And also in that fact, if you're a casual staff, you're less likely to actually be able to take paid time to participate in union goings on, whether that be councils, on committees, or even in professional development that's offered by this union. There might be someone in this room right now who's doing this completely, or multiple people completely unpaid on their very own time, because due to not having any sort of secure employment, that is not part and parcel. So I think that's a really key barrier that we do need to keep in mind, especially when the people who probably need the most representation are the people least able to often participate. And following on from that is that there was a real concern by our group that industrially our union cannot do very much to support casual academic or casualized staff very well, because we don't have the processes and they don't have the same protections that other contract staff or continuing tenured staff have. So how can we then, the issue of then gaining that membership of that very marginalized group is thus made more difficult. Especially with membership dues and other fees was another issue brought up with that as well, especially for people who are paid for some months of the year and not others. But I think one of the bigger things that we also, or sort of one of the larger themes that we were looking at that were also echoed by some of the other groups, is that are women's voices worth less, even when we're on leadership committees, even when we are speaking, when we are being heard? Is what we're saying actually being valued? Is that something that is being heard and it's being taken in and taken as important? Or, as Jeannie said, are we going to be waiting for a man to say the same thing and then have it recognized? And then how can we challenge that? It's not an issue of women not speaking up. This is a room full of opinionated women who probably speak up at a lot of opportunities given. I'll join the chorus of I'm one of them. But if that's not valued and it's not taken to action, it's not seen as important, then that does very little despite our efforts. So what sort of cultural change might we need? Speaking of some of the enablers, as one of the other groups mentioned as well, is that the union actually can offer opportunities for leadership that women might not be finding within the broader university sector. If women are disproportionately casually employed, they're very less likely to be in leadership positions, even especially when we saw that graph of academic staff, the amount of academics, women who make it past level B drops a third down to half and even less. So the union actually can offer some opportunities there to pick up leadership skills, take on a leadership role, and affect change. But there's probably some work to be done about how that can actually be supportive of your career rather than seen as a career killer or a career ender, as union involvement being that. And I liked Group 2's suggestion of some research into, is that actually true? Is that a real barrier? Is that a perceived barrier? More knowledge about that would likely be very helpful. And then we had an interesting conversation. We didn't all necessarily agree, or there's some ideas happening about how we can actually get our voices heard. Should we be using sort of trigger warnings such as feminism happening here to draw attention to the fact that we are women who have voices that need to be heard? Can we use practices like disruptive technology? Should we look to more traditional approaches such as sit-ins and distribution of letters and newsletters? How can we better organize? And I think that was one of the themes that came through most strongly when I listened to all the other three groups as well as the group of my own, is that we do need to come together because we're diverse members. We all have different needs, we have different roles, we have different trajectories, and we have different things that we want to see. But coming back to Mary Margaret Fano and the last group that reported is that what can we come together and how can we work in solidarity on issues that really matter, even if we don't necessarily agree on every small little thing as well, or even bigger issues that we might not agree on. And bringing in buy-in and membership from other groups more broadly and interested in social justice would probably be a really powerful way to do that as well. Sorry, flip my page. And I think the concept of shoulder tapping was really interesting too, and we brought that up as well. Again, it's great to get people involved and on committees, but again, what are their opportunities for progression once they're in there? Are they there as tokenistic ways? Are they really learning, having abilities to affect change and make change possible? Are we making space for women leaders even when they are elected to committees and councils? And I probably think the last thing I wanted to end on, because I think it was quite an interesting question, is what is the voice of women in the union about? Are we just on about women's issues, or are we just wanting to be a voice that actually promotes issues that are important to wider union membership from the voice of women? And I think that's a really important point to make, where just because we're women, we're not only interested in parental rights or in care arrangements or in flexible work, we're actually interested in our union and our sector supporting our workers, supporting staff, supporting students, and making higher education institutions better places for people to work, attend, and be a part of. And we don't want to get bogged down in this idea that we're only a voice for women. We are the voice of women for everyone in our union. So I think I'll maybe leave it there.